Very good. Are you the whip cracker? Yes. He got the airport and this big I find it offensive to call it DC.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could grab a seat, we'll get started here in a second. Oh, I need to get you a microphone. Yeah, okay. He wants to walk. Okay, terrific. Our final panel for today is climate politics in the private sector and on campus. So looking at some of the other actors, other sectors in these issues. David Levy from the University of Massachusetts is going to talk about U.S. business strategies and climate change. Virginia Haufler from the University of Maryland is going to address insurance and reinsurance in a changing climate. Dovev Levine is going from the University of New Hampshire is going to talk about climate action on campuses, and Truman Semans from the Pew Global Center on Climate Change, Pew Center on Global Climate Change, is going to serve as our discussant. So I'm going to turn the floor over to David with one caveat. I forgot to do my advertisement at the beginning of the session. I hope you will pick up a sheet out there for another session we're having on climate change in the media on July 25th. It looks like it's shaping up to be an excellent session, and I hope you'll pick up that sheet and come back here in a couple months and discuss these issues as well. So
I think I'll start off for a few minutes of framing, and then we'll go David.
Rock and roll. Go ahead. Chair's the last to know. That's fine.
Okay. And actually, let me just start off by giving you all a little bit of further background on our panelists today. David holds a DBA from Harvard Business School. He's currently a professor of management at University of Massachusetts, Boston. And his research mainly examines the intersection of business strategy, technology, and politics in the international arena. In the last few years, he's studied the engagement of U.S. and European multinationals with the emerging international regime to control greenhouse gases. He's published in leading business journals. I'm sure many of you have read his work, including Sloan Management Review, and he's collaborated on research with U.S. and international government institutions. Virginia Haufler is an associate professor of government and politics at University of Maryland. Her research and teaching focus on international political economy, global governments, private authority, and industry self-regulation. Dr. Haufler's also been a senior association at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a visiting instructor at a range of U.S. and overseas universities. Her publications include an international affairs article entitled "A Public Role for the Private Sector, Industry Self-Regulation in the Global Political Economy, Private Authority." And then we're also lucky to have Dovev Levine. He's a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire's Natural Resource and Environmental Studies program. His research is centered largely on the role of campus climate change engagement. He's also the coordinator for recruitment and retention at UNH's graduate school. He got his BA from UNH and a master's degree from Northeastern. So before kicking in and turning it over to David, I wanted to set a little bit of context, telling you about a little bit about the Pew Center and our work as sort of the one aspect of the applied dimension of the way that businesses engage in the policy environment, and also I'll just give a couple of anecdotes that connect universities to both the business and policy arenas on climate. So, for those of you that don't know, the Pew Center is an organization established in 1998 that's basically it's a three-part, kind of a three-legged animal. The first is a think tank. Is this not loud? Yeah, just bring it a little closer. I'm amazed. I usually am far too loud. So can everybody hear? All right. So the first of the three parts of the Pew Center is a traditional think tank. We've put out reports that are widely circulated on economics, business policy, sector issues. We also work closely in an applied way with policymakers, really not as an advocacy group as much as almost an advisory and consultative organization working on the state, federal, and international level, working with, for example, the architects of Reggie and that sort of thing. And then the third piece is what I run at the center, and that's our engagement with corporations, primarily through the Business Environmental Leadership Council. We've got a representative of one of our members, BP, here today. We're strictly independent from government and corporate funding. We get all our funding from foundations and private donations. So let me tell you a little bit more about the BELC, the Business Environmental Leadership Council. 40 companies, mostly Fortune 500, about $2 trillion in market capitalization, and 3 million employees collectively. Have a large GHG emissions footprint, either direct or indirect, and we're in the process of actually updating our calculations. We think the total footprint is probably north of 6.5 or 7% of global emissions. So it's pretty big, a lot of skin in the game. Diverse business interests, but an agreement on the need for progressive action on climate. These are just a look at some of the companies. Most of the large sectors with an interest and exposure are represented in the group. Large oil companies, a lot of large utilities, large manufacturers, chemical companies, and a lot of companies that have big brand recognition, which turns out to be pretty important in the dynamics of their engagement in the international climate regime and domestic as well. What do we try to do with them? Mainly we try to advance towards stronger domestic policy that includes mandatory limits on greenhouse gases, as well as to make progress on functional and effective international frameworks post-2012, as well as the supporting infrastructure of global carbon markets. Advancing what's happening at the states and the local level is an important part of this, primarily in our approach for a precedent-setting level for a momentum and for testing out what really works on the ground. And the way we try to engage the businesses in it, in this whole enterprise, is to get them to lead both publicly and in an insider-private kind of a way. A number of the companies that we work with aren't ready to come out and sort of have front page stories or big ads in the New York Times calling for regulation, but they're willing to get together privately with members of Congress and the administration to talk about ways to go forward. Though increasingly, companies are stepping forward. At least 13, most of which are our members, stepped forward to go publicly on the record with the Energy Committee over the last couple of months, supporting the creation of mandatory climate policy. They include BP, but also Calpine, Synergy, Duke Energy, DuPont, Entergy, Exelon, GE, PG&E, and Walmart. And in June of 2005, a number of senior executives from large corporations got together and signed on to basically a statement urging G8 leaders to support long-term market-based mandatory frameworks. And those included, beyond some of the ones I've already mentioned, Cisco, Ford, Hewlett-Packard, Toyota, British Airways, and Volkswagen. So this is the way that some of the companies are engaging. It's also happening in the insurance sector. You may have picked up in the news that Warren Buffett has started to turn his attention to this issue. When the Oracle of Omaha turns his eyes on the issue, a lot of other people do too. And one of those is the CEO of Marsh McLennan, a very large U.S. insurance company, who has now made climate change a topic of his. They have these massive conference calls with tens of thousands of their customers, and beginning in February, he made climate a central theme of that. So just to tie the link in with universities briefly, just a couple of notes. I was recently together with Yahoo to talk about their corporate climate strategies, and found that that two of the key people. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Google. And don't tell them I made that. And as you know, Google's been active on a number of policy issues and is increasingly active. It turns out that two members of their core policy team are recent graduates of Stanford's Energy and Environment program. And they're very effective. They cut their teeth while on the ground at Stanford, and they're already having an impact on an emerging major corporate player on the issue. And then, kind of closer to home, I actually share with one of the organizers, Jeff DeBelko, a love and affiliation with Duke University. I'm on the board of the School of Environment down there, and also on the board of a thing called DOOGI, which is not a very attractive acronym. It's the Duke University Greening Initiative. But I thought I'd mention it because the biodiesel program that Doogie launched, which has resulted in a campus-wide fleet running on biodiesel, in turn influenced one of the major grant-making organizations, it's public-private in the state, to invest $10 million, co-invest $10 million along with 10 from CoBank in North Carolina's first large biodiesel refinery. And two members of Doogie's sort of student staff are now on the North Carolina Commission, just 3 years later on the North Carolina Commission to study climate change. So great linkages there. I'll end there. I just wanted to give a little bit of that practical context. We'll hear in order from David, then Virginia, and then Dovev, and go to your questions.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to stand up. Seem congenitally impossible to sit and talk. There we go. You want to click? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the Pew Center's actually done a great job in mobilizing sectors of the business community and breaking the stranglehold that folks like the Global Climate Coalition used to have over policy. And what I want to sort of pose and really focus on in the few minutes that I have here is a central paradox between, on the one hand, we see a huge amount of activity going on, both in the corporate sector. If you go to the Pew website, you'll see lists and lists of case studies of all these companies and all their various initiatives going on, setting up climate teams, various kinds of research projects, carbon measurement, inventorying, preparing for carbon trading, and disclosure as well. You see more and more disclosure in the various kinds of green and social reports that go alongside the financial reports. And this goes along with all the efforts that we were hearing about at the state level, city level, Barry Rabe's work. We seem to see a profusion of efforts here, and yet, so that's the beehive there. And on the other hand, I've got this image, you might not quite make it out, it's a treadmill. This is an old sort of prison treadmill where people work really hard and climbing and climbing and climbing, but they don't get anywhere. And you look at from one sector to the next, from transportation to energy, residential, commercial, and the trend of emissions is up and up and up. And we are trying to think about what's going on here. Is it just that we're at the beginning of a trajectory? Is it a springboard? Maybe that's the metaphor that we're looking for. Or, is there something more structurally wrong with the kinds of policy measures that we're pursuing? Just as background, business is clearly a key policy player here. If we don't get business on board, things aren't going to work, and we are going to be missing targets. Cooperation is crucial because business does have the key financial, technical, organizational resources for us to be able to move forward and make significant reductions in those sectors. And business plays many, many roles, political roles as well as market roles, both as an emitter, as investor, as experts. We've seen business getting more and more involved in the IPCC process in various ways, but also as a political player, as a lobbyist, as a manufacturer, in all these different ways. Series has this quote, you might not be able to read it: companies at the vanguard no longer question how much it will cost to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but how much money they can make doing it. This seems to be sort of the new reality, the new conventional wisdom. Everybody's on board. We're all Keynesians now. No, we're all, we're all we all believe in climate change, we're all doing something about it. But of course it does affect sectors differentially. And if we want to understand the drivers of corporate responses, we need to understand how different sectors are affected, how they can possibly get engaged. And it still is a policy threat to a lot of existing companies, particularly those who've got their fossil fuel assets, the coal companies, the oil companies, and all the companies that derive from that, the cement companies that use a lot of energy, and the car companies and the airlines and so on. More than that, it's a threat to the competencies of these companies. A lot of people ask me, why doesn't Exxon just invest in renewable energy? Well, they don't know anything about renewable energy. What they know and what they're very clear about is they know geology and they know refining, and I'm a strategy professor, that's one of the things I teach, and it will be just as difficult for Exxon to be successful in silicon or in wind as it would be for me, say, to go from being a professor to being a doctor. You know, we're specialized, and that's the essence of strategy, and that's why companies can't change so easily. There are, of course, a lot of physical, financial risks, insurance. We'll get to talk about that perhaps later. There are, of course, a whole bunch of real business opportunities, the wind, the solar, but also GE looking at energy efficiency, various kinds of products, carbon trading, but even adaptation. Some of you might have seen this in London, the Thames Barrier. Wasn't initially built for climate change purposes, but they're raising it, comes over and blocks the Thames when there is a big storm surge and protecting the city. Companies like Bechtel, they'll love these kinds of things. Billions of dollars of profits in these kinds of things. But for the oil and coal companies, harder for them to see real opportunities. So in my own work where I was looking at the oil and auto companies, came to this insight that expectations are really important. It's pretty hard for companies to really figure out objectively where their interests lie. And what was interesting is that European companies tended to be moving ahead because of their expectations. Yes, there'll definitely be carbon restrictions. Scientific evidence, is going to get stronger and stronger. Oh, consumers, they'll be buying these products because we'll convince them how to. And much more optimism generally about renewable technologies, low emission technologies. Whereas in the US, completely opposite response. Oh, we can defeat Kyoto. That's what the GCC is there, the Global Climate Coalition is for. And really convincing themselves that climate science, there's a very interesting I found was within some of the oil and auto companies, a whole layer of management that protected senior management from climate science. They would only feed through the articles that reinforced skepticism. And as well as a deep skepticism about markets for low emission products. Because why would Americans ever buy diesel? They remember it from the 1970s as dirty, vibrating, noisy. Whereas in Europe, 50-60% of new cars are diesel. But somehow the marketing people locked in their heads is this old vision in the US of why people wouldn't buy it. But understand, this is in people's heads. These are projections about the future, not necessarily any reality there. But a lot of convergent pressure more recently, and so you do see moving towards sort of maybe more centrist position, US companies as well, partly into a reaction to competitors. When we initially spoke to the auto companies, they'd laugh at the Prius. Oh, nobody's going to buy that. Nobody bought our GM electric vehicle. We lost $500 million on that, and nobody's going to buy the Prius either. Of course, now they're being forced very rapidly to catch up. So there's a competitive reaction piece that drives some convergence here. But these folks get together all the time. So when you get the BP climate folks getting together with Chevron, Texaco, and so on, that they begin to develop a convergent. They're sitting in the same institutional atmosphere, going to the same meetings, reading the same reports. They begin to think similar things and develop common political stances, and in particular developing common outlooks on markets. This is an important one because, for example, in the oil industry, it is now becoming clear that any kind of carbon regime isn't going to hurt them. The soaring demand for fuel, for cars, for airplane travel in particular, isn't going to hurt them. There's not really a substitute on the horizon for that, and they're well diversified into gas. So the American oil companies can back off on their opposition because they realize that they're sitting pretty anyway. And the Pew has done a great job here in diffusing this new win-win discourse, meaning, we can make money by being green, particularly around climate. Whether it's true or not is sort of, there's a lot of empirical evidence that maybe it's not exactly true, but all the war stories and all the anecdotes go a long way to selling this to companies within that grey zone where we're not exactly sure whether addressing climate is going to be a good thing or not, is going to be a winner. Plus, business made some big missteps here. Efforts to challenge the science in the US really fell flat on their face, at least in the broader public, and got exposed by some of the environmental organizations. It did provide some good cover in Congress, but outside of that, I don't know. Well, there's this glass half full, half empty. On my optimistic days, I'm sort of more down here, that all of these efforts are part of the learning, the building capacity, setting the stage for national policy, and so on. On my more when I'm feeling more depressed, I'm up here. The key sectors are ignoring climate change. This is coming out of the most recent series reports that are reviewing climate actions by industry, and most particularly bothering is that we're seeing round 2 of industry opposition to the state level initiatives. If somebody in the Global Climate Coalition said to me, it's mission accomplished. We destroyed Kyoto. US won't sign on, and that's more or less gone away as a realistic threat. Now there's this new threat at the state and city level of a whole new bunch of regulations, and this is Schwarzenegger. I'll be back. But they're back. The threat of regulation is coming back, and we're seeing a regrouping of industry at the state level as well to fight off the various kinds of things coming out of California, coming out of Reggie. So, are we going to see round 2? It'll probably look a little bit different, because what's it going to look like with industry on the one hand embracing climate as a real problem, we have to do something about it, but on the other hand having to fight all these local initiatives? It's going to look a little maybe hypocritical, I don't know. But there is this sense, there are some economic drivers, demographic drivers, if you like, why we are on this treadmill, why we're running to keep still. You're seeing just this year, the auto companies bringing out a whole bunch of hybrids, but primarily to increase power, not to address efficiency. Plus you have the boom in China and India, lots of people buying new cars. We're not going to be reducing oil for transportation. I mentioned this already. We might see more efficient homes, but we're seeing much larger homes, particularly in the US. And you start looking again at China and India and the rise of air conditioning and everybody wanting single-family homes. Resurgence of coal power, I think somebody already mentioned that earlier. Yeah, it's not a pretty picture. I mean, the idea that we're really going to get some real reductions here in the next 15, 20 years is looking a little grim to me. This other point is worth making. The limits to the green niche strategies. The Prius is being sold to a particular 5% of the population who are willing to pay a premium for that. It's the Ben & Jerry's strategies, and almost by definition, these strategies are limited in terms of the numbers they're intended and can reach. Might diffuse from there, but we'll have to see. One thing I'd like to pose is that in terms of understanding these contradictions, is that corporate political responses are part of an integrated energy system, and that energy system has political and economic dimensions. So the existing fossil fuel system is a system that has tremendous inertia. It's locked in on the economic level, the infrastructure level, but also on the political level. You think about the relative power of the existing fossil fuel-related industries. We've got business models that generate profits. We have a lot of political support, subsidies. There's a whole circular system here that ends up having a lot of inertia, even down to the level of the assumptions, the ideologies about what kinds of transportation are viable, what kinds of policies are viable, and so on. So with that level of inertia, it gets very hard to get radical change. It gets very hard to move things. And my suggestion here is that what we're seeing is, in this sort of phase 2, is a degree of business accommodation to an emerging, very weak, flexible regime, a regime with targets that don't require you to do very much. And because they don't require you to do very much, then it's okay for now for business to join in. It'll be interesting to see what happens if these targets do actually require significant new products or more direct threat to business. So this is the way I would characterize this evolving regime, and we'll hear more about it from Barry Rabe and others. But this is my sense of some degree of involvement with Reggie and looking around the other areas. Are we really seeing Enron-style accounting in the way that you can look at emissions and it's enormously complex, but by the time you sort of start figuring out what's coming in on the pipe from the West and what's and the various CDM credits that you could import into Reggie, you can see the lawyers are getting involved in this and thinking, how are we going to get around this? This is the sort of the way that people are thinking about these things. There's a big disjuncture between the initiatives at the state and city level and the resources and expertise, because the hundreds of billions are at the Fed level. If we wanted to do something serious, we could take $100 billion and instead of putting it into a war effort each year, we could put it into high-speed rail. $100 billion will get you a national high-speed rail system, or at least the outlines of one. And don't think that a sailor for a minute averaging 50 miles an hour, Boston, New York, is high-speed rail. Yeah, when I was a kid, we'd take the train from London to Manchester in 2.5 hours, and that wasn't high-speed rail. But so think of it. Anyway. But what I'm saying is these are political choices. So we're talking about resources, and the resources really exist at the Fed level. I mentioned before electricity prices in Massachusetts. You look at your bill, and there's a subsidy that goes to renewables, 0.000 something cents per kilowatt hour. 40 times as much of that goes to the transition charge, which is mostly a bailout for the nuclear power plants. These are political choices, and it shows where the lack of resources at the state level, as well as even where the political priorities are. People in political science talk about the competition state, that increasingly policymakers see it as their role primarily to promote the competitiveness of the region. Regional competitiveness is the dominant discourse. And you can see that people like Romney, but even filtering down into other policy elites, that's the primary concern, the primary driver of policy. And the environment is sort of some appendage to that. And that becomes a problem. It's not that we shouldn't be concerned about competitiveness and economics, but again, my view is there's plenty of money around. It's a matter of how it's allocated and where our priorities are. But this discourse seems to cut off at the start our ability to think a little bit more systemically. I should also say, in the US, it's just very, very hard to do things systemically. It's very hard to have comprehensive policies. Look at healthcare. We have a model of policy making in the US that's lots and lots of patchworks that don't do very much, and that and so you end up with a healthcare system here that costs twice as much as Western Europe and has the inferior healthcare outcomes. So very, very similar, perhaps, to thinking about what's going on in the climate area as this sort of bizarre, fragmented patchwork. Corporate strategy as political action. This is what I'm working on recently, is actually thinking about corporate economic strategy as having a political component. I think companies do understand that there is this system, that there is an energy system, and that it's shifting in some ways. They're being forced to accommodate to a reality of science in some ways, but if we understand corporate strategies as having a political in various ways. Clearly, the day-to-day actions of companies as investors, manufacturers, in the types of products they choose to make, have planet-wide impacts. So this is in the public realm. In a sense, corporate strategy is a public issue. Okay. And these strategies are politically contested. So if people are discussing whether or not Ford should be making expeditions, then those choices about what products they're making are political choices. They're part of an arena. Low carbon strategies are, in part at least, political positioning as well as market positioning, defense against activists who are pushing them one way, as well as trying to get a seat at the table. So there's a way in which corporate strategy is simultaneously political and economic. There's also a way in which the technologies that companies develop become a basis for policy. We saw that very, very clearly in the ozone case, where in the ozone case, where DuPont's chemicals, the treaty more or less the Montreal Protocol more or less got written around HCFCs from DuPont. But we saw a similar thing going on in California with CARB, that the original targets of zero-emission vehicles that were originally written for electric vehicles got adapted and rewritten for hybrid. So there's a way in which companies are able to use their technologies to develop products that then become the basis of policy. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that we can see the intertwining of product, economic, technology strategy with political strategy. They become inseparable in a sense. Okay. On the other hand, the idea that we're going to make this transition to a clean energy economy, where I've already talked a little bit about the inertia, it's important to recognize just how weak economically and politically this sector is. I mean, I've done some work in Massachusetts and New England region looking at, we have quite a large community of small firms in solar, in biomass, in fuel cells, but they're small. And they don't have any clout, and they don't have the connections in Washington, and they don't have people in the cabinet here. So they're there. I mean, it certainly helps when GE starts getting on board, and when BP and other, or I suppose more the American companies than the European companies get on board. And so we might be beginning to move towards some tipping point there. But essentially, this is a weak political constituency. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up. I'm out of time. A couple of other things. If you like the talk, there's the books. Enjoy the film. It's like the Da Vinci Code, yeah, but this is the other way around. So. Okay. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I think we'll do questions at the end.
Who's next?
I'm next. Okay, my topic is a subset of what David Levy just talked about. And in fact, our papers go together quite well, even though we wrote them completely independently. I'm going to look at the insurance and reinsurance sector and its relationship and activities with regard to climate change. Why would we be interested in insurance and reinsurance? I've actually had people many times ask me, what is interesting about insurance? In fact, for the topic at hand, the insurance sector is in fact quite interesting. Number one, it's just huge. It really is. The value of the insurance sector rivals that of the fossil fuel sector. I mean, they're a very large portion of the economy. It also is itself, it affects greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly it's a very paperwork intensive sector and has killed many trees in doing its business. So their policies themselves, in terms of sustainable policies, have an impact on themselves. Like the rest of the financial services sector, however, one of the interesting things about insurance is that it has leverage over other industries that contribute more directly to greenhouse gas emissions. By changing what they sell, the terms under which they sell it, the price at which it sells its products, it can actually influence the behavior of other actors. I should also note that the insurance sector is one of the biggest institutional investors out there, so their investment decisions have a great influence. Finally, the main product that they sell is the means to manage, transfer, and diversify risk. And of course, risk is central to the debate about climate change and its consequences. This kind of risk shifting is critical to the operation of the modern economy. In fact, the Nobel Prize-winning economic historian, Douglas North, argues very strongly that the development of institutions to manage risk is, in fact, an important part of developing a modern economy and is vital to its functioning. Now, the insurance sector itself is very complex, made up of many, many different lines, what they call lines of insurance, or different kinds of product, life insurance, auto insurance, property, marine, a whole variety of things. And it is also made up of a number of different participants. We all know the direct insurers that sell directly to us. There are also reinsurers. The insurance industry doesn't have enough capacity, i.e. enough money, to cover all the big risks of a modern technologically advanced society. Therefore, they themselves buy insurance from the reinsurers. There are also a variety of other service industries within this whole sector, such as brokers who place the insurance, such as Marsh & McLennan, and various rating agencies to help them decide what is a risky thing to cover and what is not. And some interesting little service firms within the sector include such things as Control Risks, Inc., which is a British firm that provides to insurers the services of dealing with those who have kidnapped and are kidnapped someone that the insurance company has insured. So it's a very complex industry and lots of little side corners to it. I'm not going to talk about the political risk and kidnap and ransom insurance today. That's not quite relevant to climate change. Now, the insurance sector itself obviously is there to manage risks for others, but many observers today have pointed out that climate change poses a direct threat to the industry itself, because it changes the underlying calculations on which they price and make available insurance. It affects how they determine what is an insurable risk and what is not. If they get it wrong, they will go out of business, and the insurance sector could collapse. And this is the fear. So, does the insurance sector actually recognize the problem? Well, you would think this would be easy. Major natural disasters due to weather equals, gee, there's a problem. But in fact, it's taken a long time for the insurance sector as a whole to really recognize any links between climate change and what they do, and to really think about changing their behavior. Insurance industry analysts began recognizing potential problems caused by changing weather patterns back in the 1980s and 1990s, when there were a series of major losses each year attributable to severe weather, and each year reaching record-breaking proportions. And then it just continued to get worse. In 2005, weather-related losses were more than $200 billion of value, of which about $70 billion was insured. And those are big numbers. Now, I should note, European insurers and reinsurers recognize the link between climate change and insurance much earlier than the U.S. industry. And this aligns well with what David was talking about with regard to climate change more broadly and the industry response. European insurers and reinsurers have been working more closely with governments and intergovernmental organizations on this issue for over a decade now. The environmental advocacy community was one of the first to really make this link and to start really trying to persuade the insurance sector to take this seriously. They really see the financial sector as a whole as a potential lever against, for instance, the big greenhouse gas emitters. And in fact, there's a number of environmental advocacy groups who have worked to put together a variety of campaigns working with the financial sector, and they have targeted the insurance sector in particular. One person stands out, Jeremy Leggett of Greenpeace, who began advocating on this issue way back in 1992. Insurers based in places like Germany, Switzerland, and the UK, these are the big insurance and reinsurance centers. They began to publicly make that link between insurance health and climate change-related risks back in the mid-90s. And in fact, they worked with environmental groups and with the UN Environment Program to establish what is now known as the Insurance Industry Initiative. Here, they made commitments regarding climate change and how they would integrate that into their own business. I should note that the Association of British Insurers recently came out very strongly to sort of come up with a British version of this, or to push forward the climate change and insurance link even more strongly than it had before. And this is on an industry-wide basis within Britain, and not on the company-by-company basis that you see in the UNEP initiative. In general, the U.S. industry has ignored the problem. I should note, I don't know anything about Canadian insurance. I thought about that in preparing for this. I mentioned it to Stacy, who said it's okay. And in fact, the industry really is based in Europe and the United States. When you think of insurance and all financial actors, you think of New York and London. And in the case of reinsurance, you think of big companies like Munich Re and Swiss Re. Obviously, these are not Canadian companies. So the U.S. industry pretty much ignored the problem up until very recently, like this past year or so. They did not participate in developing UNEP's insurance industry initiative, and only 2 companies to date have signed up from the United States. Most U.S. firms, other than maybe 1 or 2, have made any public statement on the issue. Most express doubts about the link between their losses and climate change. Instead of changing their practices, U.S. firms believe that major disasters are really the responsibility of the U.S. government to deal with. So it kind of is a paradox because we think of the U.S. as being the place where we keep government out of everything. Not true. So why the different response? Very briefly, a lot of it has to do with simply research and information. The European insurers and reinsurers actually invest in research. Actually, they're knowledgeable on these topics. Swiss Re, for instance, I think since 1970, they're the big source of data on weather-related disasters. So they've been tracking this for a long time. They are beginning to integrate that information into the risk models. In other words, instead of looking at the data on sort of the past history of weather-related losses, they're actually using predictive models, looking into the future, looking at climate change models to predict trends based on their models instead of on historical data. Only recently, I think it was last year, did the U.S. National Association of Insurance Commissioners set up a task force to study climate change. The liability system obviously is different. I mean, that drives a lot of corporate behavior in the United States. In this respect, U.S. companies know that if they make any commitments, they may actually be liable in court for them. Even vague voluntary ones like the UNEP initiative, they really have to think about whether they're going to be subject to some kind of lawsuit if they don't actually live up to voluntary commitments. In addition, the U.S. industry has had to pay out a lot on environmental losses that they thought were not theirs. U.S. courts have decided that an insurance contract signed 40 years ago is still good today, even though it's no longer enforced. But at the time that some environmental accident or pollution or liability occurred, the insurers are still responsible today for that. There's obviously also a very different institutional framework in Europe versus the United States. European insurers actually see opportunities to make money in climate change. Not just losses, they're not just looking at the loss side of things, but because there are things in Europe such as green markets, emissions trading, all sorts of things that make it possible for a company to invest in new products that deal with climate change in a more positive way and actually could be a source of profit. They're more willing to make that link between climate change and the insurance sector. The U.S. regulatory system actually discourages some more innovative things, such as the use of those new predictive models. U.S. regulations for the insurance sector actually require them to use historical data to base their underwriting decisions on. And finally, a big difference is the government role. The U.S. government simply plays a much larger role in insulating insurers from excessive risk than they do in Europe. Again, it's somewhat of a paradox. U.S. insurers can, in fact, reliably assume that the U.S. government will play the biggest role in paying for any disasters related to weather change. So, choices and consequences for the insurance industry. The choices facing the insurance industry, if they, with regard to climate change, are they could respond to changes in risk by changing their pricing of their products. They do this. They raise their rates, as we can see in disaster-related areas of the United States today. What does this do? It drives individuals and companies to not buy insurance. So therefore, it sort of gets away from that diversification of risk, concentrates risk, and makes it more difficult for people to make decisions about where they're going to build a house or what kinds of lines of business they're going to go into. Insurers can also simply withdraw from a market, a place, a particular kind of insurance, particular companies or persons. They can simply say, not insurable. And in fact, this is a lot of what we see happening today. Again, if this happens, I think it's in Florida right now, there are no property insurers active. It means the government must make some choice, some decision. They can also, insurers can change the terms of their contracts, and I think this is what a lot of the advocacy groups would most like to see them do. In other words, use the conditionality inherent in an insurance contract to reward or provide incentives for companies to change their behavior in ways that mitigate climate change. Of course, they can also do political action. And the UNEP initiative, to some degree, that is part of what it was. It was part of a political response to the fossil fuel sector on climate change issues. And, of course, the favorite option, I think, of many companies today is simply do nothing. So where does that leave us? Again, most insurers are choosing the do nothing option. And even the ones who have made that link between climate change and the health of the insurance sector are not changing a lot. This is still a very profitable sector. Even in this past year, with, in the United States, Katrina, Rita, et cetera, and all these major disasters and huge losses for the industry, most of the industry was still very profitable. So no one wants to back away from this, from actually covering things that perhaps should be labeled uninsurable. They can, in fact, count on the government to step in. That's what happens. And a lot of the proposals you see today are for, by the insurance sector and by others, is that are for federal governments, national governments, to establish bigger disaster funds. And there's even a proposal by the Association of, what's it called? Association of Island Nations. That's not exactly what it's called. But basically the countries that will be underwater soon, they would like there to be an international disaster insurance fund established. There are some proposals for the insurance sector to deal more directly with the consequences of climate change and not simply ignore it and do nothing. They need to maintain the financial solvency of the industry. That means they have to have enough money to cover their losses no matter the size of the disaster. So they are beginning to consider changing pricing and availability, as I mentioned before. And many people see this as a way to send signals to the rest of industry, the more direct greenhouse gas emitters. By changing pricing and availability of different kinds of insurance, again, you can influence the behavior of others. And it may be painful, but there are those who argue that this, in fact, would provide a nice little transition to that changed climate we might have in the future. Things such as there's no insurance available for your house by the beach. That would be a good thing under this scenario. Other changes that are being contemplated, there's innovations in the actual insurance products provided, and some of it not directly by the insurance sector. For instance, the financial sector now does provide catastrophe bonds and things like that. So there are a variety of new risk management options out there. One of the sort of little sidelines of the insurance business is something called directors and officers liability insurance. And some environmental advocacy groups are seeing this particular little part of the insurance industry as perhaps being influential because they're beginning to hold CEOs liable for bad environmental policies, because bad environmental policies can come back to haunt a chemical company or an oil company or things like that. So if you're liable, basically your insurance company offering you this insurance is going to have to pay. And if they're going to have to pay, they're going to try and change your behavior by making you be more public about your environmental liabilities in order to avoid these lawsuits. So there's all sorts of little byways within the insurance sector and the ways in which it might influence the behavior directly of companies. Finally, there is the option for these companies to become more active politically. We don't see a whole lot of that yet. Again, the UNEP insurance industry is probably the biggest thing out there. And while many companies have now signed on, as I mentioned, only 2 U.S. firms have signed up to this. So I think there is a great opportunity for the insurance sector to have greater influence on the climate change issues. They are beginning to admit that there's a problem after this year of massive weather-related disasters. But whether that will translate into real action instead of talk about possibilities for action is yet to be seen. Thank you.
Terrific, Dovev. Good. Wrap it up. Let's clean up better.
Thank you very much. As has been pointed out, the U.S. seems as unlikely as ever to implement a federal system for greenhouse gas reductions. In the meantime, however, local governments, the business sector, and NGOs have begun to fill some of this policy gap. In this regard, progress has been made. This is evidenced by such programs as California's stated emissions reduction goals, as well as voluntary business measures on climate change. In many ways, however, such initiatives could learn much from university climate actions occurring across the nation. According to David Orr, a leading voice on campus climate action, no institutions are better equipped to catalyze the necessary transition to a sustainable world than universities. They have access to the leaders of tomorrow and today. They have buying and investment power and are widely respected. Consequently, what they do matters to the wider public. Campus climate action, then, is a key towards overall climate change mitigation efforts. The reasons for this include the fact that universities can significantly impact the regional greenhouse gas emissions. These reductions are directed within their local community, which exemplifies the adage of thinking globally and acting locally. Also, and perhaps most important, universities educate our future leaders, with 4,000 U.S. universities teaching 14.5 million students each year. With the world being increasingly impacted by global warming, our future leaders must learn how to live in a climate-changed world. Universities, therefore, will have to play a significant role in this regard. This is enhanced by the fact that university enrollment between 2000 and 2013 is expected to have increased by 23%. So, many positive actions are occurring on campuses which the government, business sector, and NGO sectors could learn from. How could these sectors learn more from campus climate action? Two ways may be to publicize and link such university actions. To begin, they could be much more publicized and linked to other climate mitigation efforts. This is rooted in the ideas of E.F. Schumacher, a renowned economist who formulated much of the current thinking on alternative energy usage. According to Schumacher, an important step is to collect, systematize, and develop scattered knowledge and experience already existing in this vitally important field of sustainability, which is related to climate change efforts. He believed the necessary knowledge for major progress on these efforts exists, but not in an organized and readily accessible form. In this regard, it appears that there's no standard available to assess all of the campus climate action which is currently occurring across the nation. Subsequently, there's a need to measure and assess these actions. One way to achieve this is through the organizing principle of CORE. CORE is used at the University of New Hampshire as a way to organize our thinking about how to incorporate sustainability into all of the university's actions. I should note that while I'll give examples of each principle now, my paper, which is available on the website, includes a much more extensive listing of such examples. CORE stands for Curriculum, Operations, Research, and Engagement. Curriculum. As I mentioned earlier, a key concern is whether universities are preparing their students to live in a climate-changed world. For example, then, curriculums need to reflect such issues as the global and complex nature of climate change, as well as demonstrate the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. This is important as the noticeable effects of climate change often occur far away from their point of release, which means that our students are often not having a clear understanding of what these emissions mean to the larger picture in the world in general. A key point here is also that the behavior of the next generation of leaders needs to be altered if they're to appropriately address the growing implications of climate change. An example of a curriculum appropriately educating students in this regard is the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. This is a multidisciplinary graduate program which has produced many alum who are well suited for employment in state and national programs dealing with climate change. An example of how this is an excellent program is that many of the program's graduates go on to staff the California Energy Commission office. This is interesting as it demonstrates the effect of a state investing in its university's climate efforts and then reaping the benefits of well-educated state policy entrepreneurs who then go on to further develop and enhance state climate policy. The second core principle is operations. This relates to how the university is run, including transportation, building maintenance, and overall energy usage by the school. In short, it addresses university activities which produce greenhouse gases. This is important because in almost all cases, universities are the largest energy users and waste producers in their regions. In many cases, universities have altered their operations in order to reach Kyoto Protocol emissions targets. Furthermore, some have been able to go well beyond Kyoto in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Successful university operations can also model climate action initiatives for the government, business, and NGO sectors. An example of a successful campus operation initiative is the University of New Hampshire's cogeneration plant. This was recently activated, and this plant produces approximately half of the power necessary for powering the University of New Hampshire, which is a fairly large school with around 15,000 students. This cogeneration plant has led to a 40% reduction in UNH's greenhouse gas emissions since its activation. Also of note is that the plant will pay for itself relatively quickly, at which time large financial savings will be accrued by the university. So this is a great example of a win-win situation. UNH saves money and also makes great progress environmentally. This type of win-win scenario would be highly attractive to businesses seeking to frame themselves as quote-unquote green and responsive to the climate change issue. Another example is the California State University system, which is the largest four-year university system in the world. The CSU system is committed to meeting 20% of its energy demand with renewable power by 2010. It also has effectively pushed its emissions to 17% below 2004 levels. This greatly exceeds the reduction efforts of both Kyoto and the RGGI program. The third core principle is research. This addresses what is studied in depth and integrated throughout the fields and disciplines at universities. As mentioned previously, universities will educate the next generation of leaders and therefore should find ways of promoting climate change, focused education in all of its programs and activities. Also, universities function as the centers of intellectual power and development of many new technologies, which will be important in climate change mitigation efforts. An example of such research is found at Portland State University. Here, they developed research competencies in many core areas related to climate change, including business practices, transportation, urban design, and green technologies. The fourth and final core principle is engagement. This relates to the need for connecting campus climate efforts to those at the local, regional, national, and international levels. This is important as it's thought that for a stable climate regime to emerge, major actors have to share some common frames regarding policy approaches to mitigation and adaptation. In short, engagement is all about how the university connects its climate actions to the larger picture. There are a number of such examples of engagement. For example, several years ago, the UN Decade for Sustainable Development was kicked off at UNH. Also of note is the Talloires Declaration, which is a statement signed by 300 university presidents in 40 countries in which they pledged to make their universities more climate friendly. Another example of engagement is the NGO called Clean Air, Cool Planet, which worked with UNH to become the first university in the nation to develop a greenhouse gas emissions inventory tool for campuses, which is very important so then we can begin to measure again what type of emissions we're actually producing. This is a great example of a university and an NGO working together towards significant progress on greenhouse gas reductions. There have been many successful campus climate actions, yet universities have a long way to go. According to a recently released Energy Action and Apollo Alliance report, only 80 U.S. campuses purchase clean energy. Again, that's out of 4,000 schools total. Furthermore, only a small handful of campuses have developed comprehensive plans for greenhouse gas reductions. It should be noted that all 4,000 U.S. campuses using 100% clean energy would quadruple the country's current renewable electricity usage. Now, it's a very lofty goal, but again, it shows what further efforts really could produce. Thus, more attention should be paid to campus climate action. There's a need to look at what makes some universities more active than others on this issue. Also, how are universities working together, and also with other institutions, including NGOs, the business sector, and also other schools on these issues. This is important as research shows that coalitions help to gain publicity and also aid each participant with information and resource sharing. Yet, only 107 out of the 4,000 U.S. universities worldwide have signed the Talwar Declaration. So the question is, why is that? Another interesting line of research may also be an assessment of campus influence on state climate policy. All these questions stem from the fact that there's no single measure for assessing campus action currently occurring. In conclusion, there are 5 reasons why increased attention should be given to campus climate action. First, universities are leading by example. Second, they've made significant progress in their own greenhouse gas reductions. Third, they play a major role in educating the future leaders of the world. Fourth, they can model initiatives for future state policy as well as beyond state policy. And fifth, they may be linked to state-level policymaking. Thank you very much.
Well, we've got some good time for discussion, so why don't we throw the floor open. We have microphones. We ask again that you use it so that our folks on the web can hear it. And who would like to kick us off? Gentleman in the back.
A question for Dovev. If you're a college campus, what's in it for you to go spending extra money to buy wind tags, for example, to cover your campus usage of electricity? Is it just good publicity? Do you get better students coming to your university as a result of the... How do you justify that to your board of directors?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of research out there that shows that the efforts towards greening your campus or becoming more environmentally friendly usually have very short buyback periods. So, for example, a larger initiative such as the cogeneration plant that I mentioned before will likely pay for itself in about 4 or 5 years. After that time, the school will start to actually save a lot of money on their energy costs, and they also get the environmental benefits as well. So financially, there's actually a lot in it for the school.
Okay, Ian?
Is that not a...
I didn't get an answer to my question.
Okay. Could you restate it?
My question was, what's in it for a school to pay extra money to buy wind tags, for example? They're not making any money on that. They're paying extra.
Sorry, wind tags?
Wind tags or wind credits. Like a lot of campuses have been buying clean energy by buying clean energy RECs, renewable energy credits.
I see. Well, I think that's
clear in my
certainly...
question? I'm sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. I think that I certainly have to do more research on that, but one guess towards that would be I think the publicity does help. I think that, again, it does help to be framed as being aware of the climate issues and also to become more sustainable. So I think that that does have a publicity effect.
Okay, and we'll move over to Ian Rollins. Lots of questions. That's great.
Question for Dovev as well. 2 things I'm wondering about, and wondering if they're happening on campus and wondering if they're important. Green procurement, and the second one is investment of pension funds in a socially responsible manner.
Sure. Well, I think to answer the first part about green procurement as far as purchasing goes, it is happening. There was a study done recently of UNH. It was someone's dissertation, actually, that was published, I believe, 2 years ago, that took a long look at the purchasing habits of UNH, and it found that if you do really make an effort towards educating the buyers about the benefits of buying green, it can have a noticeable effect. And for example, I read that one achievement, I think that was made actually by Tufts University in their quest to become more climate friendly, was that they began to make some deals with electricity utilities, and it turned out that the electricity utilities actually would give the university rebates because it would actually reduce the electricity utilities' need for producing additional generators or generating capacity. So again, showed a link between the corporation and the school, and both kind of have a benefit from becoming more green or sustainable.
Pension funds?
And on the pension funds, I can't speak specifically about pension funds. I know that at least two schools that are known for investing a large part of their endowments towards, I believe, socially acceptable programs. I believe that the University of Berkeley and also Tufts University both have a very good reputation for producing or investing a lot of their funds.
Thank you.
Okay. You want to go over to Tim, and then we can just work around the room.
Just a comment to David and Virginia, in particular about corporate politics that may be of interest to everyone here, is oftentimes environmental policy is, there's an underlying consideration when it comes to the corporate sector interacting with the political sphere, and that is that there may be undue influence when it comes to fundraising and money issues. In Canada, about 2 weeks ago, I actually spoke with a Washington lobbyist who was up in Ottawa, and I told him about what Canada has implemented recently, and I think actually this has big implications in the future for environmental issues, and that is the previous government in Canada, the Liberal government, implemented a new, very significant cap on political fundraising, and that was limited to $5,000 per individual in Canada and $1,000 for a company or a union. So that was really significant. In fact, the new Conservative government has taken that a step further, and they have completely banned at all for all federal political fundraising interests any union or corporate donations, and also individuals are now limited to $1,000. So in terms of influence from money, it's a very significant development. I can't see it happening in Washington, I've got to say, but in Canada, it is in terms of these issues. It's quite interesting, just in terms of the access theme.
Okay. Why don't we take a couple more? If you could just pass it right up to the gentleman there, and then the lady right behind him.
Thanks. Actually, this is a question, I guess, for David, but anybody in the room could really comment on it. You mentioned some of the industries, corporations that are not very active on climate change, emissions policy, anything, and you mentioned agriculture and food. And I'm just curious if you can add any more to that, because I would think that there's a lot of there's obviously in most of us deal a lot with the energy industry and the complications of trying to reduce emissions and how complicated it is with energy being produced in one place, shipped somewhere else, and whatnot. And I think the only industry that's more complex is probably agriculture, and with Byzantine collection of subsidies and whatnot. Can you elaborate any more about any effort at all in the agricultural community to address emissions?
Hold that thought, David, and
Sure.
hand it right behind you, the lady in the pink.
My name is Kathleen Ambrose. I work for Nova Chemicals in Canada, a very large file emitter according to the original definition in Canada. But I was curious about David Levy's presentation and all of the presentations about signaling out companies that are working on climate change policies. And I would just suggest that you think about it. There may be a lot that are not in the public eye, but no company has the option of not working on climate strategy. So in my experience, every company is working on it because of the high energy costs. There just isn't any choice. You have to think about energy costs, and in thinking about energy costs, you think about energy efficiency, energy intensity, and lowering emissions. And so most companies have, even though they may not be signed up with Pew, they have voluntary emissions reduction strategies on their websites. They have lots of them. If you really look through sector by sector, I don't agree that the agriculture sector hasn't been working on it, because we do work with a lot of those companies, and they are working on it. It's different. It's a patchwork. But because you have this responsibility to deliver shareholder value, you have to use your money wisely. You have to invest your capital wisely. So when you talked about political drivers, companies are measured by their delivering shareholder value, and the investors themselves measure you on delivering value. You have to deliver use of your energy as an input and the value of that, and so you are forcing reductions in global in GHGs all the time, and reporting them usually on your own company website, not necessarily always through something like Pew. Some industries do it jointly. The chemical industry does it jointly with a specific target. But I would just expand your definition, because there are drivers for companies all companies have those drivers, and I don't see it as an option for any company not to be working on it.
Okay, great. We'll take one more, Michelle, and then we'll let the panel. Oh, sorry. I didn't know there was another one. I thought I was making around the circle here. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Michelle. Simone Pulver from Brown University again. This is a question for Virginia and David. So the evidence is mixed if the BP strategy is going to pay off for BP in the long run. And it seems likewise in the insurance case. You're making an argument that, even though the U.S. insurers haven't sort of taken the European strategy, they're still doing really well. I'm interested in, if you're trying to make a political argument or the political case, where would you look within sort of, industry to make the argument that U.S. industry has missed the boat by not being more aggressive on climate change? Like, is it something like the Prius? Is it the car? Would you point at car companies as the example? I'm just interested in where would you point to, or where would you find examples of, if you're trying to support the argument that the U.S. has missed the boat or U.S. companies have missed the boat?
Okay, since we're approaching the time, Susie and then Michelle, and then we'll give our panelists an opportunity to make a final statement.
I'll just speak up. One quick question that's sort of parallel to the networking question that we had earlier, and that is to Dovev. There's a growing student movement that focuses on energy and climate in the U.S. at least. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about sort of how much you see that sort of translating the experiences from different campuses across the country, and what role you see that growing movement play in pushing for action. I mean, historically, student movements have played a very big role in forcing public attention and policy change. So, do you see that happening?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that
Dovev, let's just take one more, and then it's all yours. Michelle, no, you're going to pass.
Yeah.
Okay, then now go ahead. Take it. You be the first.
To me? Okay. Well, it seems to me that one example of that, I think it's called the Campus Climate Challenge, and that's had, I think, a good effect on a number of universities as far as I can see. And it seems that they're actually really strengthening their coalition a lot more, to the point where it's getting a lot of media attention. If you look in magazines, I think they're read by a lot of university students. I saw in Rolling Stone a couple months ago, there's a big article on actually the Campus Climate Challenge, which is exactly what you're referring to. So I think that national attention has to have some very good feedback. And also would then, I think, the students can take that exposure right to their school and say, look at all these things that we're getting attention on. You should really start to focus more attention and resources on our efforts.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Yeah. I'd make a distinction between the macro politics, getting your oil guy in the White House, and the money that's in PAC money, political action campaigns, and the micro politics that I was talking about a little bit more. The micro politics, for example, in we had a local case as well with MIT, also put in a cogen plant, but then the local utility turns around and says, well, it's in our regulations that even if you're making your own power, if you want to stay connected, the standby charges will charge you, a couple of million a year to make the whole thing. They're worried about cogen, and so they're using existing sets of regulations. But that's part of the inertia, and it's part of sort of the micro-politics that makes it hard sometimes to get all these win-win opportunities. And that's part of the inertia of the system. The regulations are written for large, centrally generated power. There is a lot of low-hanging fruit, and there are a lot of these win-win opportunities around. Getting companies to pay attention to it, I think, is what Pew and others, WRI, are doing very, very well, is getting companies to begin to see cost savings on energy as a profit center, as it were, and I've had a lot of arguments with economists agreeing with you here, because economists will say, well, companies must already by definition be optimizing. There aren't any $100 bills lying around, and it turns out that there are quite a lot of $100 bills lying around when you start paying attention to it and putting management attention there. But that's still, it takes time to get companies to look at that. In terms of agriculture, to be honest, I don't know too much about that. I know there was very influential studies about going back 10 years that really said the impact of climate on agriculture in the US at least would be a bit of a wash, and the big US companies didn't seem too concerned about the physical impact. They seemed much more concerned about the cost of energy on fertilizer costs, for example. So in that sense, they were more worried about regulation than real. It might have changed to something. I haven't really followed that sector. And in terms of, has the US missed out? That's an interesting question. Certainly the wind is the clearest case where Denmark has generated the leading exporters, Vestas and who is it, NEG Micon rather. By priming their own industry, they develop their own exporters, and the US falls behind there. And maybe in auto technology as well, you could say that the US has fallen behind relative to hybrids. Maybe hybrids won't be the winning technology. In my view, diesels are much cheaper, much more reliable. You get the same energy benefits as you get out of hybrid, but without all the extra costs and clean diesels. But you've got a whole, again, an institutional historical trajectory of regulation that makes that difficult in the US. But the Exxon folks were very, very clear when we interviewed them. When it becomes clear which technology is emerging, say for energy, we'll go and spend $1 billion or $2 billion, and we'll buy a company. We'll take an investment strategy, and they might be right. BP unfortunately could be losing a lot of money investing in the wrong type of silicon, because who knows? Maybe it'll be thin film silicon. Maybe it'll be an organic technology that MIT's working on that'll be the solar that'll take off. Maybe it'll be solar thermal. Who knows? So that's a difficult strategic question, is to say, is the US missing out on opportunities? My sense is yes, and part of the case I was making actually for Reggie myself is that the New England region has a comparative advantage in some of these clean energy technologies, and that we could encourage some of our local companies as regional clusters that will then be exporting as other parts of the country catch up. But it's a tough case to make, because economists don't agree with you about that. Because they don't believe in clusters and they don't believe in, anyway.
Okay, I think the question that was most directly related to me was the missing the boat question. I've been mulling that, trying to figure out the answer. I don't think I was arguing that the insurance industry in the U.S. has missed the boat so much as by choosing a particular strategy, they have maintained their competitiveness in a very competitive sector of the economy. They have made a lot of profits in recent years, so in that sense they haven't missed the boat by sort of losing out competitively. But the consequences of their decision are sort of larger for the public and for the pocketbooks of people in the United States. If if risks are not redistributed widely through the insurance and reinsurance, then that means that it's going to be costly for the U.S. taxpayer. So in that sense, by making it more difficult for U.S. insurers to be more progressive on climate issues, it comes back to haunt the U.S. as a whole, not the insurance sector. Now, it could be in the future as this whole, carbon emissions trading schemes really take off and green markets grow and this whole concern with energy efficiency expands. Maybe the U.S. industry will lose some of its competitiveness because the European insurers have really been in there for a while already and developed new products and new expertise that the U.S. industry doesn't have. But I don't think I could point to any example today where I would say, well, that company, if it had only changed its policy to take account of climate change more directly, it would have done so much better. I'm not sure I could say that.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on the ag question, and I agree with the list of industries that David pointed out. I think you'll actually see some significant change in the ag sector. We already see signs of it where, for example, the large crop science companies see some real opportunities around biofuels. Companies like John Deere are actively exploring the issue, but a lot of it is not around climate change. It's around energy security and energy independence. And so you see some of the most significant political activity and business and growing level of business engagement, not around climate legislation, but around these the bills that Harry Reid has just introduced, Senator Lugar, a lot of folks coming out of sort of the agricultural states. So that's one way of looking at it. Another theme that came up is this: where you put attention, you will start to actually find new opportunity, or at least cost savings, whatever it is, whether it's in energy management, whether it's in understanding opportunities for new products and services in the insurance industry or other industries, whether it's sort of that group organizing at the university level and getting board level buy-in. Hey, we have either some branding opportunity here, some cost reduction. We've seen over and over again that that in our member companies and others, this is what happens. It's sort of it fulfills itself and it grows. There's a danger and a downside to a lot of all of this just in the political arena, and that is that those that oppose mandatory policies have more and more evidence. I mean, David, you were pointing to this with all these success stories. Hey, all this is free and it's going to just happen, and so voluntary programs are the way to go. The positive note is that we've just, as part of a report that we're bringing out this summer on basically a how-to manual for corporate strategies that address climate, we surveyed 35 large corporations, and 90% of them expect to see climate regulation enacted in the U.S. in the next 5 years. So that's pretty positive. That's why most of them are at the table, and the design phase is really kicking off in Washington.
Oh, well, that's great to end on an optimistic note like that, given some of our discussions about the U.S. context. That's terrific. Well, terrific. This has been an excellent panel, an excellent afternoon. I hope you all will come back and join us tomorrow morning at 9 when we kick off again for a morning, most of the morning, early afternoon, second day. It is, David, are there any other, or Stacy or Henrik or anything? Yeah? Yeah, so through lunch tomorrow. So we hope that you'll join us again. Your homework assignment is to go find these papers online tonight and read up for tomorrow's presentations. But please join me in thanking our panelists for this last discussion.